It's the Acting Income Podcast with Ben Hauck, Episode 3, How I Figured Out My Monthly Spending and Saved Up to Move to New York City.
It's the Acting Income Podcast with Ben Hauck. Turn your passion into income, Ben will show you how. With all the resources that you need to make it as an actor in an expensive city. To stay balanced and make money, you really can't go wrong with actingincome.com.
Welcome to the Acting Income Podcast. I'm Ben Hauck, and on this podcast, we talk about acting, money, balance, and tons of other topics related to earning an income as an actor. I want to thank you for tuning in. This is Episode 3, titled How I Figured Out My Monthly Spending and Saved Up to Move to New York City. Pull up the show notes right now at actingincome.com/episode 3. And now, on to the episode. In this episode, I'm going to talk about how I figured out my monthly spending and saved up to move to New York City. And for this podcast, I'm going to go over something that I call my saving sheet, which I'm holding right here. And I'm offering it as a free download. So if you go to actingincome.com/saving sheet and enter your name and email address, you'll get it sent to you immediately and you can follow along with this podcast. So, as I told you, I'm going to talk about how I figured out my monthly spending and saved up to move to New York City. It was back in 1998 that I graduated from college, and I knew that I was going to be moving to New York City. My aim was to move there in about a year, and my finances were not in exceptional shape being a college student, and moving to New York City, well, I knew that it was an expensive town. So I wanted to move there and move into an apartment to be able to afford rent and be able to afford my living expenses and also afford everything else. That meant I had to understand how I spent my money. So, back in the day, I came up with a system. And the system was this. I would write down everything that I spent my money on. So that meant I would get receipts, or I would write things down on a sheet of paper. And in the beginning, I resolved to write it all down at the end of the day what I'd be spending. Well, that didn't work out exactly as planned. It was a little too time-consuming to write it down after every evening. So I'd collect receipts for everything I'd purchased, and I'd put it in my wallet, and then I'd put it into a little envelope at the end of the evening, and then save it up over the course of the month. And if I didn't get a receipt for something, I would have to remember to write it down on a sheet of paper. I ended up carrying in my wallet a little sheet of paper that I'd write down the expense and how much I spent, and I'd just save that in my wallet. So, at the end of the month, I had a mound of receipts and a whole bunch of information on expenses. I also had the pay stubs that I collected over the month, so I needed to save those and kept those with this. At the end of the month, I took all of the receipts that I had, and I looked at each receipt. I wrote the date on the receipt, and I wrote the kind of expense. Now, in the beginning, I had to figure out how to classify all the different kinds of things I spent my money on. There were some obvious things like rent and food. Those were pretty obvious classifications, but there were also some other classifications that I had to figure out for myself. I came up with one that was hardware and toiletries, and I combined that into one category, and anything that kind of fell into the category of hardware or toiletries, that was one category. If I spent money on food at a grocery store, that food was called food, but if I spent money on food at a restaurant, that was considered restaurant. This helped me to figure out where I was funneling my money. So each receipt I went through, I dated it and classified the items on the receipt. And if there was more than one kind of classification represented on the receipt, say maybe I made a purchase of food and hardware, or let's say I bought milk and toilet paper, I would write on that receipt food and hardware/toiletries, and I would actually break down how much I spent on each one of those and write that on the receipt. I'd take all the receipts and pile them up by day. So if it was January 1st, there'd be a pile of January 1st receipts, and January 2nd and January 3rd all the way to January 31st fanned out in front of me. I then took a ledger that I bought at Staples, a 3-column ledger. And in the ledger, I would go to each pile, the January 1st pile, the January 2nd pile, etc., and I would write down the expenses for each day. So if it was food for $5, I'd write that down in the ledger. If the next item was hardware and toiletry for $2.99, I'd write that down in the ledger. And I'd do that for all of those piles in that ledger. Tally up everything that I spent that month. So in the ledger, I had a good sense of everything that I'd spent my money on, and I'd classified it in different ways. So I knew where my money was going when I spent it each month. Now, I did this for January, I did this for February, I did this through March, April, etc. And when I did that, I figured out how my money was being spent from month to month to month to see how wildly I was spending in different ways. And I would see trends. But I was also saving to move to New York City, so I also wanted to get a sense of whether my income was helping to compensate for these expenses. Was I in the black or in the red? Was I making money or was I losing money? I would take the ledger and then enter it on a saving sheet that I created just using Microsoft Excel. And that's what hopefully you've downloaded and you're reading as you're listening on. I'm going to explain the saving sheet, and it shows the different categories on the saving sheet that I use. These are the ones that I actually use today in 2015. I still do this 16 years later. I keep track of everything I spend and everything I make, and I write it down or keep a receipt, tally it up at the end of the month, and end up with some information on my spending. I spend 4 hours a month doing this. And that is a ton of time for some people to spend and concentrate on just receipts and money. But the thing is, it's the secret of my success. That's how I feel comfortable when I am living in such an expensive city as New York City. I've gotten a sense of where my money goes and what kind of money I make by way of this process. And being so intimately familiar with my behavior in that way has made me more comfortable when I've needed to make big money purchases or when I'm confronted with the obstacle of having to make a big money purchase and understanding where I needed to shift my money in order to make that kind of purchase. So, the saving sheet. The savings sheet is titled with the month, and I also count the number of Fridays in the month when I'm doing my savings sheet, because that tends to give me a sense of how many paydays I'll encounter. So I have some regular expenses, and I've broken the sheet down into kind of this section of regular consistent expenses, and then some expenses that are more or less miscellaneous, meaning they're a little bit more irregular expenses. So of my regular expenses, they're rent, health insurance, internet, utilities, my cell phone bill, haircuts, laundry, transportation, food, and gift purchases. Actually, come to think of it, gifts are a little bit more miscellaneous, but hey, I regularly purchase gifts for people. So, I use the savings sheet along with my ledger. Once I've entered everything into my ledger, I then transfer the amounts of money that are associated with each of these categories into the boxes on the savings sheet. So, if I wrote in the ledger that I spent, let's say, $1,000 on rent this month, then I would write $1,000 into the rent section on the savings sheet. For me, I have a whole other section, as I said, of miscellaneous expenses, and these are what they are currently for me. I spend on restaurants, media, books, clothing, shoes, acting-related expenses, computer, theater or concerts, movies/Netflix, postage, fitness/running. I tend to do some running. Supplements, hardware/toiletries, storage, and just a catch-all other that helps to cover all the little things that don't fall into any of these categories. Now, that's usually how I categorize all my current expenses these days. Almost all of my expenses fit into one of these categories that I've outlined. And when I'm taking receipts, I'm categorizing them. And I put them in a little bag, and at the end of the month, I then put them into my piles, write them into my ledger, then write them into my savings sheet. Now, my savings sheet has two columns next to these categories. It's the actual column and the projected column. The projected column is actually something that I've done the prior month, which is I've projected what I think I would spend in this current month in these different categories. So rent is usually pretty consistent. If I was paying $1,000 rent, last month I would have wrote on the savings sheet, my projected rent expense was $1,000. So then when I wrote in my actual expense, I might find that I spent $1,000 on rent. Put those two together, my projection was on target. I do a projection and I do an actual so that I'm thinking in the future and thinking about what I'm going to be spending, and that might affect other ways that I spend my money in the future. What's also interesting is I've never budgeted. I've only projected. A budget and a projection seem to be a little bit different. I think most people think of budgets as more like rules that they can't spend over a certain amount. But projections for me are a little bit more like principles. They're what I hope to spend or probably should spend, or I should aim for that, but they're not usually locking me in. They're just giving me a sense of how much maybe I expect to spend in that category. Now, there's a lot of categories and a lot of projections, and I will also get a sense by projecting if I go over in another category how it might start to impact yet another category. So I do the projections, and then when I sit down to do my savings for the current month, I tally up the actuals and I compare and see how much I was on target. That also gives me a sense of how good am I at projecting. I've had months where I redid my apartment, and I don't remember exactly how much I was off, but I was only off by a few dollars in my projection, which was extraordinary to me because I spent thousands of dollars redoing my apartment, but my projection almost nailed it. So that covers up the expenses. Now, when I'm done with the actual, I tally up all of the actual totals, and I come up with my total expenses for the month. So on this savings sheet, I can see exactly what I spent in the prior month, and that's a great thing to find out. Now, a completely other column on this savings sheet is the income side. It's simplistic for me. I end up with a lot of little paychecks, so I can't really use the form as this is, but it's basically this. It too has an actual column and a projected column. I project the prior month, what I think I'm going to make in this current month, and then there's the actual pay that I receive. So I tally up all my actuals and put them in a column, and then the next thing I do is I take the total expenses from the prior month and put that next to the income and do a little math. I figure out what I made, I subtract my expenses, and then that's my net for the prior month. That's what I made or what I didn't make in the month. When I look at my net, it'll be positive, and that means I made money that month, or it'll be negative, and that means I lost money that month. That may not matter so much. I've had a number of months in my time living in New York City where I lost money, but I've had also months where I've gained money, and I've done okay. It helps me not to freak out when I see this number, or it might make me freak out a little bit, but usually I don't freak out. It just makes me think like, okay, I got to pull back in the next month, and my projections need to kind of come down when I'm doing my next savings sheet. I keep track not just of this current month, but how that affects the net from a prior month. Let's say in December I made money, and in January I lost money. Well, the net before I might have made $1,000, but maybe this month in January, maybe I lost $1,000. My net will be zero. That gives me some sense of what my year to date is. I also measure from when I moved to New York City. So I look at my savings from when I moved here 16 years ago. I leave a little comment section on the savings sheet so I can kind of put a narrative to the expenses that month. Maybe there were some paychecks that didn't come in. Maybe I had some big expenses that I had to do. The comment section helps to describe what was going on. So if I look back at this savings sheet, I know why there were so few expenses or there were so many expenses. In the very bottom box are payment notes. I had to keep that after I realized that sometimes I needed to keep track of who was paying me because sometimes I would have taxes taken out and sometimes I wouldn't. I wrote those kind of comments down. So let's say I made $1,000 on a job. In the payment note section, I would write the $1,000 was associated with ABC Partners. That helps me when I look back over my expenses from the prior year and have to figure out who paid me when I'm doing my taxes. All in all, the culmination of this savings sheet is for me to figure out what I've netted in the prior month and how I'm doing financially. It's more than just me at a cash register saying, yeah, I'm doing okay. I think I can afford this coffee. It's me actually sitting down and looking scientifically at where my expenses went and knowing whether it is actually true that I can afford something. Did I net money last month and does that pay for it? Or am I losing money like a fiend and should I not pay for it? The result of doing my expenses, filling out this savings sheet, is peace of mind and sanity so that I'm not scared when I spend money in an expensive city or when I am being more responsible about spending money when I'm in an expensive city. I really think this has been the secret to my success in moving to New York City. I haven't really had to pinch pennies because I have a good snapshot of what my financial situation is, and I know with excruciating detail where my money is going. Please use the savings sheet I provided you. Feel free to adopt it and adapt it to your own situation. Change the categories however you so choose, and spend a few hours every month looking at how you spend your money. I think you'll find that it'll really help you out, and that it will give you that peace of mind that I also have when you field your acting career and you're faced with all the expenses that come with it. Or it will help you prepare for the different expenses you have and tell you whether you are truly in a position to afford those things. And that's this episode. Be sure to download the savings sheet featured in this episode by signing up for the Acting Income mailing list. Go to actingincome.com/savings sheet to sign up. The show notes for this episode are available at actingincome.com/episode 3. You can find Acting Income on Twitter and Facebook. If you'd like to sponsor an episode, check out actingincome.com/advertise. I'm Ben Hauck. Thanks. See you on the next episode. And for more information, as always, check out actingincome.com.